Hi, where are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments.
The acoustic profile inside the subglacial routing vault of Summit Portal 04 was a frozen, crystalline shriek. Situated exactly 2,000 meters above the lower industrial valleys, the high-altitude transit station was a massive cavern of raw granite and reinforced concrete, built directly into the sheer rock face of the northern pass. The air was bitterly cold, carrying the stinging, metallic taste of high-voltage ozone, fine ice dust, and the burnt iron scent of heavy friction-braking arrays. Every 90 seconds, the automated atmospheric exhaust louvers cycled with a heavy, mechanical thud shudder that sent a blast of sub-zero mountain air through the structural framing, a violent reminder of the vertical blizzard raging outside the massive steel blast doors. Harlan Vance stood on the snow-dusted observation platform of the primary switching deck, his hand in a stiff, frozen leather mitten resting on the exposed iron counterweight of the manual track shunting lever. At 82 years old, Harlan was a stubborn, unyielding obstacle embedded within the automated rail infrastructure of Euro-Alpine Transit. He wore his classic canvas field jacket, its heavy fibers so deeply saturated with old switch grease, diesel soot, and frozen mountain moisture that it remained completely rigid against the sub-zero wind. Behind him, the sleek, weatherproof terminal of the RailCloud OS network blinked with a steady, clinical neon purple light, broadcasting optimized transit speeds directly to the central terminal in the lowlands. Harlan ignored the digital screen. His eyes were locked on a physical, mechanical tension rod gauge tapped directly into the hydraulic cylinder of the main high-speed track switch. The steel needle was vibrating within a microscopic 2-millimeter red zone, a high-frequency mechanical shudder that the cloud's automated software completely filtered out as routine environmental vibration. To the corporate logistics architects operating from their warm offices in the Tech District, Summit Portal 04 was a masterpiece of winter transit efficiency. To hit the lucrative end-of-quarter cross-continental freight bonuses, Julian Vance, the 28-year-old director of Autonomous Vector Corridors, whose career was built on cloud-managed scheduling algorithms, had deployed a global firmware update to the heavy electric freight locomotives. With a single administrative command, Julian had increased the transit speed of the 4,000-ton autonomous or trains by 40%, while simultaneously cutting the mandatory thermal brake cooling cycles at the Summit station down to zero. On Julian's centralized dashboard, the entire mountain sector glowed in a perfect, triumphant indigo, displaying a record-breaking transit velocity through the Alpine Pass. Harlan, however, did not need a digital interface to know that the high-speed track switch was freezing into a solid, unmovable block of steel. He could hear it in the high-pitched, metallic screaming sound echoing from the track bed, the unmistakable acoustic signature of extreme thermal contraction. The sub-zero mountain storm, combined with the immense friction heat generated by Julian's accelerated train schedules, had caused the massive alloy switch rails to contract unevenly against their concrete foundations. The cloud-based digital position sensors, calibrated exclusively for standard operating temperatures, remained completely blind to the structural stress, reporting a perfect, clear track vector while the core of the switching mechanism was actively warping itself out of alignment under 80 tons of lateral tension. The heavy, insulated pressure door connecting the station to the administrative annex blew open with a freezing rush of mountain air, admitting Julian Vance into the vault. He was dressed in pristine, neon-accented Alpine corporate gear, his spotless white thermal boots and lightweight composite jacket looking completely out of place against the ice-rimed concrete and heavy iron machinery of the lower deck. He held a custom, transparent field tablet that cast an aggressive blue glow over his sharp, impatient features. "Harlan!" Julian yelled, his voice strained as he tried to project over the deafening, echoing roar of the massive ventilation fans. The Central Logistics Dispatch has flagged Summit Portal 04 as an unresolvable routing bottleneck. Your manual mechanical lock on the primary switching deck has halted the approach of Wave 7, a 4,000-ton automated iron ore train currently descending the 6% upper mountain grade. The locomotive's internal computers are reporting a clean track signal, but your physical lockout is forcing the train to drag its emergency brakes. Release the manual lever and clear the digital manifest right now. Harlan didn't remove his mitten from the iron lever. He used a heavy brass pick to clear a thick wedge of hard blue eyes from the exposed slide chair of the switch rail, pointing down into the dark track pit. The switch rails have contracted past their physical tolerance limit. Julian, your high-speed scheduling is running these heavy ore trains too close together. The track doesn't have time to shed the friction heat before the mountain wind hits it, causing a thermal shock that has jammed the hydraulic piston. You don't have a clear path. You have a split switch. If wave 7 hits this junction at 70 miles an hour, the lead locomotive will split the rails and plow directly into the structural support pillars of the avalanche barrier. Julian let out a short, highly contemptuous laugh, tapping his glass screen aggressively to display a real-time thermal stress simulation. Look at the rail cloud analytics, old man. We are running a live, multi-variable structural simulation that samples track resistance and steel density every millisecond. The safety margin is holding completely steady at a stable 1.8 index. The optimization software automatically compensates for minor thermal contraction by increasing the hydraulic pressure on the switch cylinder. What you're experiencing down here is just standard mechanical stiffness from an old installation. This corporation didn't invest $80 million in autonomous rail logistics to have its highest yield freight run blocked by an old mountain hand who's afraid of a winter storm. Julian stepped closer, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel as he lowered his voice into a cold, clinical threat. Let's be completely clear about your status, Harlan. Your technical field variance is being archived at the end of the week. If that manifest isn't verified and the switch released within 3 minutes, I am submitting an immediate emergency report for corporate sabotage and operational defiance to executive HR. I will personally terminate your senior medical coverage before midnight, cancel your housing permit in the Valley Settlement, and ensure you spend your remaining years sitting in the industrial dust of the outer rail slums. Sign the clearance, or get off my deck forever. Conflict, the shattered guide. The emergency confrontation did not wait for an executive board meeting or a formal legal summons. It erupted exactly 90 seconds after Julian utilized his administrative master key to bypass Harlan's localized lock and force the Central SCADA system to execute the Wave 7 transit profile. Deep within the mountain tunnels above the portal, the rhythmic, terrifying roar of the approaching 4,000-ton autonomous train began to echo through the concrete vaults, a low-frequency rumble that grew louder with every passing second. Harlan didn't argue or attempt to struggle for the console. He reached over and flipped a heavy mechanical toggle on his local diagnostic panel, switching the main display wall from the stylized RailCloud wireframe model to a raw, unedited hydraulic pressure line feed connected directly to the internal cylinder of the track switch. On Julian's transparent tablet, the digital train icon continued to move smoothly along its pre-calculated trajectory, entering the portal sector with textbook precision. Watch the internal hydraulic pressure on the switch lock cylinder, Harlan said, his voice entirely calm, steady as iron. On the raw analog line graph, the pressure curve wasn't climbing gradually, it was rising in a vertical, jagged red spike. The frozen alloy switch rail, pushed past its thermal stress threshold by the immense force of the automated hydraulic override, had completely locked up. The metal had reached its zero-tolerance point under the extreme cold. Within seconds, the pristine corporate interface on Julian's tablet began to violently glitch. The clean indigo dashboard fractured into a chaotic wall of amber and crimson warning blocks as a massive, destructive kinetic shockwave, the sheer weight of the 4,000-ton train hitting the misaligned track, came rushing through the steel rails. It's just a temporary signal lag. The cloud routing protocol will automatically engage the locomotive's dynamic braking resistors to control the descent. Julian stammered, his fingers sliding uselessly across the frozen touch interface as the terminal began generating a frantic stream of low-level system faults. hydraulic cylinder rupture, track alignment disconnect, critical structural failure. The software can't guide a train when the physical wheels have already sheared the guide pins right off the ties. Julian, Harlan stated calmly, pointing a heavy mitten toward the pitch-black tunnel mouth behind them. Out in the dark vault, the sound of the machine completely changed. The deep, low-frequency roar was suddenly replaced by a sharp, deafening screech of tearing steel as the lead 4,000-horsepower electric locomotive hit the split switch. Under the immense kinetic force of 4,000 tons of moving, or the massive high-strength alloy wheels of the train sheared off the rails. The heavy locomotive tilted violently, its steel flanks slamming into the reinforced concrete foundations of the portal with an impact that shook the entire mountain face, sending down a massive avalanche of rock and snow that completely blocked the outer mountain exit. Julian stood paralyzed in the freezing darkness of the wrecked gallery, his transparent tablet shattered and covered in frozen hydraulic fluid, its screen completely dead. The rail cloud platform was totally unresponsive, blinded by the physical destruction of the primary track sensors, leaving the mountain network completely unable to safely halt the secondary automated freight trains that were still descending the upper grade toward the block portal. The system is completely dark. I can't reach the upper signal blocks, Julian whispered, his face pale with terror, his hands shaking violently as the emergency alarms began to wail through the tunnel. The master server won't accept the emergency shutdown sequence from an unverified terminal. The server isn't listening because the physical fiber optic trunks were severed when the locomotive smashed the concrete cable trays. Julian, Harlan said calmly. He stepped through the drifting snow, reached beneath his grease-stained oak desk, and pulled out a heavy yellow protective container that was bolted directly to the deep structural steel of the floor. Inside sat an ancient, military-grade manual isolation switchbox, a solid block of cast iron featuring a massive, uninsulated mechanical copper knife switch, and absolutely no digital logic or cloud connections. This is the Federal Mountain Transit Infrastructure and High-Altitude Kinetic Hazard Mitigation Act of 1988, Statutory Emergency Treaty No. 714, Harlan announced, his voice booming over the sound of the wailing sirens as he placed a thick, heavy green archival brief on top of the iron box. The cover was worn down to the raw cloth, featuring a massive, crimson lead and wax seal impressed upon the lower margin. When your corporate optimization group redesigned the rail interface code 4 years ago, they categorized all pre-digital manual emergency isolation protocols as obsolete legacy architecture to save on server compliance indexing costs. Harlan continued, looking down at Julian. They assumed that an automated rail system with a 99% uptime rating didn't need a physical, non-digital emergency cutoff. Harlan grasped the massive wooden handle of the copper knife switch. But this treaty contains an unappealable, non-expiring federal safety mandate. Section 7, paragraph 14 states explicitly that in the event of an unmonitored track derailment that threatens the structural integrity of a primary mountain transit pass, the senior field inspector holds absolute, unappealable authority to execute a total mechanical isolation. I am pulling the knife switch, Julian. I am throwing the high-voltage physical shunts. The upper signal blocks are dropping to absolute physical stop arms. The oncoming trains are frozen in their tracks. And under federal law, because this catastrophic failure was caused by the deliberate bypassing of physical thermal restrictions, all transit and logistics licenses for Euro-Alpine transit within this entire Alpine corridor are immediately frozen pending a full forensic excavation by government engineers. He slammed the massive copper blade down into the grounding blocks. A bright, blinding flash of green electrical arc lit up the concrete gallery as the main power feed to the entire sector's overhead catenary lines was physically shorted out and disconnected. The roaring mechanical echo of the distant trains died instantly, leaving only the sound of the howling mountain wind outside the shattered portal doors. 6 months later, the hypermodern, high-velocity administrative offices of Euro-Alpine Transit had been completely dismantled, their slick glass desks, and glowing holographic displays sold off at asset liquidation auctions. The corporation, entirely unable to honor its transcontinental freight and mineral supply contracts due to the indefinite, legally mandated freezing of its mountain infrastructure, had collapsed into a swift, devastating bankruptcy. The comprehensive federal safety investigation triggered by Harlan's physical treaty had exposed a widespread corporate policy of intentionally deleting track stress and thermal warnings from the cloud logs, resulting in severe criminal indictments for the executive board and the permanent revocation of the company's regional operating certificates. Summit Portal 04 was no longer a high-speed throughput node. It was a quiet, strictly monitored hazardous engineering recovery zone wrapped in yellow federal warning tape. The massive electric locomotives on the surface were silent on their pads, and the subterranean tracks were being slowly, meticulously cut apart with industrial plasma torches under the watchful eye of federal engineers to physically clear the wrecked or cars. Harlan Vance stood on the concrete observation platform overlooking the main track deck. The air was cool, clean, and entirely free of the toxic, suffocating smell of burning electrical insulation and melted steel. He wore his same canvas field jacket, though it now bore a heavy, polished brass insignia identifying him as the Chief Technical Trustee of the Regional Mountain Transit Safety Bureau. The position was non-corporate, backed directly by federal statute, carried absolute operational veto power over any private terminal, and came with a permanent lifetime tenure that no executive board could ever threaten. A figure walked slowly down the concrete ramp from the access tunnel, his posture hesitant, defensive, and deeply humbled. It was Julian Vance. His pristine corporate uniform and high-tech utility, where were gone, replaced by a faded, generic blue industrial denim jumpsuit. His hands were chapped and stained with dark graphite grease, and he carried a heavy, manual track alignment gauge on his shoulder. Following the criminal liquidation of his division, his technical credentials had been permanently flagged and blacklisted across the transit registry, leaving him with immense personal liabilities and a professional history that no modern firm would ever risk touching. "Mr. Vance," Julian said, his voice quiet, raspy, and completely stripped of its former artificial corporate eloquence. He kept his eyes lowered, looking at the gray concrete near Harlan's heavy leather boots. "The Bureau's regional office. They told me that all manual labor assignment for the track clearance crews must be personally vetted and signed off by your desk. I've applied for the entry-level position of third-class mechanical line clearer for the lower portal curves. I need the authorization to retain my family's basic housing permit in the Valley settlement." Harlan looked at the young man for a long, quiet moment, the silence between them punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic clink-clink of a manual chisel clearing out an ice block down on the tracks. The lower portal curves require manual ice clearing and track checking every Thursday morning at 4 o'clock sharp. "Julian," Harlan said evenly, his voice steady as iron. "No automate de SYNCS, no cloud de remindiers, no digital das guardas. If your hand slips or you fail to check the alignment with a manual caliper, a shifting rail could spring out and take your leg off in a second. You report to the tool room on Monday morning at dawn. You'll be issued a manual canvas logbook, a brass caliper, and an iron pry bar. If you can learn to respect the contraction of the steel and the reality of the mountain, without needing a screen to tell you it's safe, you might actually turn into a real rail engineer someday." Julian nodded quickly, a look of profound, desperate relief washing over his face. "Thank you, sir. I'll be there. 4 o'clock sharp." The fundamental flaw of the modern digital technocrat is the arrogant belief that because an industrial transit process can be modeled in a multi-threaded cloud simulation, the physical laws governing that matter become flexible. A software interface can be easily programmed, calibrated, and manipulated to display whatever reality its creators require to protect a corporate metric. It can smooth over a critical mechanical vibration, it can ignore a dangerous thermal contraction event, and it can declare a catastrophic track hazard to be an optimized success in order to protect a quarterly profit margin. The digital world is compliant, flexible, and completely indifferent to truth. But the physical universe does not negotiate, it does not compromise, and it does not read dashboards. A 4,000-ton steel mass forced down a frozen 6% grade does not know who the autonomous quartermaster is. An alloy switch rail deep within a dark mountain gallery does not care about federal bonuses, corporate branding, or velocity metrics. Thermal shock, kinetic energy, and the unyielding laws of thermodynamics are completely blind to human ambition, corporate titles, or cloud-based efficiency models. They cannot be ignored, they cannot be reasoned with, and they cannot be deleted during a server system update. When an organization begins to value the dashboard over the physical machine, its destruction is no longer a matter of chance. It is a simple matter of physics. The truth of the physical world will always assert itself against the simulation, and it usually arrives in the form of a fractured rail, a smashed locomotive, and an old field inspector with a physical book that your software forgot to index.